Imagine a man, not a warrior, not a king, not a conqueror of armies or builder of empires. Just a man who owned nothing, nothing except a wooden bowl, a coarse cloak, and a staff worn smooth from years of walking. A man who slept inside a large clay pot in the open marketplace of Athens, beneath skies that offered no shelter from the cold or the rain. A man who ate when strangers gave him food and drank from his cupped hands when the bowl seemed too much to carry. A man who barked at people who offended him, walked backward through the city streets to see if anyone would notice, and masturbated openly in public squares simply to prove a point about nature and shame. A man who, when the most powerful ruler the ancient world had ever seen, a young god in armor, a Macedonian king whose shadow fell across 3 continents, stood before him on a sunny afternoon and offered him anything he desired, anything at all, looked up slowly and said only this: "Stand out of my sunlight." That was Diogenes of Sinope. And the question that has haunted philosophers, scholars, and curious minds for 2,500 years is not simply what he did, but why. Why would a man choose to live like that? What drives a human being, a rational, thinking, feeling human being, to abandon every comfort, every convention, every last thread of what we call civilization, and choose instead the life of a stray dog in the streets of a Greek city? What breaks a person so completely, or perhaps, and this is the more dangerous question, what liberates a person so completely that they arrive at that place? To understand Diogenes, you have to understand what he lost. And to understand what he lost, you have to go back. You have to go back to a port city on the southern shore of the Black Sea, to a place called Sinope, to a time before philosophy, before Athens, before the clay pot, and the barrel, and the legends, and the insults, and the fame. You have to go back to the beginning, when Diogenes was simply a man's son in a prosperous city, and when his world was still intact. Sinope was not a backwater. In the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, it was a thriving, important city, a colony of the great Greek city of Miletus, planted on a narrow peninsula that jutted out into the Black Sea like a finger pointing north. It was a place of commerce and motion, a hub where trade routes converged, where ships carried goods between the Greek world and the kingdoms of the Pontic hinterland. Wool and timber, wine and olive oil, grain from the fertile plains beyond the mountains, all of it passed through Sinope. And where trade flows, money flows. And where money flows, there are those who count it, weigh it, assay it, and, inevitably, those who are tempted to make a little more of it than there ought to be. Diogenes was born into the family of a man named Hicesius. His father was a banker, or more precisely, what the Greeks called a trapezites, a money changer, someone who sat at his table in the marketplace and exchanged the coins of one city or kingdom for those of another, profiting from the difference in value, the small but cumulatively significant margins of trade. It was honest enough work, and it placed the family somewhere comfortable in the social fabric of Sinope. Not aristocrats, not the old landed families with their ancient claims to honor and privilege, but solid, established, respected. The kind of family whose sons went to school, learned to read, learned to argue, were expected to take their place in the civic life of the city when the time came. A good family, a respectable family, a family with a future. We do not know what Diogenes looked like as a young man. We do not know whether he was quick or slow to laugh, whether he was popular among his peers or something of an outsider, whether he loved someone, whether he had ambitions that pointed toward politics or trade or something else entirely. The ancient sources are silent on his youth in the way that ancient sources so often are. They cared about the philosopher, about the legend, not about the boy who existed before the philosophy. But we can imagine the texture of his days, because we know the texture of cities like Sinope, of Greek civic life in that era. The noise of the harbor, the smell of salt water and fish and hot stone in the summer, the particular quality of light off the Black Sea, which is not the deep blue of the Aegean, but something greener, more opaque, more northern. The rhythms of the agora, the marketplace, where his father worked and where, eventually, everything would fall apart. The precise details of what happened are disputed, as they always are when a story has been passed through centuries of retelling. But the broad outlines are consistent enough across the ancient sources to be taken seriously. At some point, Diogenes was probably already a young adult, old enough to be involved in his father's affairs, something. happened with the coins. The word used in the ancient sources is parakarotene. It means, literally, to deface or alter the currency, to change the stamp on a coin. In practical terms, this means something like counterfeiting or perhaps the debasing of currency, shaving metal from coins and restamping them, or producing coins whose face value exceeded their actual metallic content. It was a serious crime in the ancient world, an offense against the city-state itself, because coinage was not merely an economic instrument, but a symbol of civic identity and trust. The face on the coin was the face of the city. To corrupt the coin was to corrupt the city. Whether Hesiod conceived of and orchestrated this fraud, or whether Diogenes himself was involved, or whether both father and son were participants in the scheme, or whether Diogenes was an innocent victim of a conspiracy that ensnared his family through no fault of his own, none of this can be said with certainty. Later in his life, Diogenes himself would speak about coins obliquely, in ways that seemed to acknowledge some personal connection to the scandal without fully clarifying its nature. One of his most famous sayings, and he would become, in time, extraordinarily famous for his sayings, was that he had merely done to conventional currency what he would eventually do to the conventional values of society itself. He had tested it, found it false, and recoined it. He made a kind of poetry of the scandal, transforming it into metaphor. But at the time, there was no poetry in it. There was only catastrophe. What happened to Hesiod is unclear. Some accounts say he was imprisoned. Some say he died in disgrace. The family's property would have been seized, their standing in the community destroyed overnight in the particular, total way that only public exposure of financial crime can destroy a family's standing. Not merely the loss of wealth, but the loss of the trust that had taken years to build, the loss of membership in the community, the loss of the assumption of good faith that underlies every ordinary transaction of daily life. Their neighbors, the men who had greeted Hesiod at the agora and spoken with him about the price of grain or the news from Athens, those men now looked away or stared with the flat, cold curiosity of those watching a disgraced family pack their belongings. And Diogenes, whatever his precise degree of guilt or innocence, was expelled, exiled. The word in Greek is pheuge, and it carried a weight that is hard to fully recover in translation. Exile in the ancient world was not simply a geographical relocation, the way a modern person might move from one city to another in search of a fresh start. Exile was a kind of social death. The city, in the ancient Greek conception, was not merely a place but the condition of possibility for a fully human life. To be a citizen of a city, to have your name on the rolls, to vote in the assembly, to participate in the religious festivals, to be subject to the laws and protected by them. This was what it meant to be a person in the fullest sense. Outside the city, you were something less. A wanderer, a stateless person, someone without a place in the human order of things. The ancient Greeks had a word for this condition too. They called it being without a polis, without a city, and they understood it as a kind of profound incompleteness, a lack of something essential to human dignity. Diogenes walked out of Sinope, or perhaps more accurately, he was driven out of Sinope, not by armed men, not necessarily by a physical act of expulsion, but by the unbearable weight of shame and the legal impossibility of remaining. He left behind everything that had given his life its shape and meaning: his family, his home, the city where he had grown up, the community that had known him since childhood. He left behind his identity, because identity in the ancient world was so thoroughly civic, so thoroughly bound up in the question of where you were from and who your family was, that losing your city was in a very real sense losing yourself. What does a person feel, walking away from the place they have always called home, knowing they cannot return? There is something almost impossible to articulate about that particular variety of loss. The loss not of a person through death, which is its own devastation, but of a life, of a whole structure of meaning and belonging that has been abruptly and violently removed. The exile knows that somewhere, behind them, the city is continuing. The marketplace is still open. The harbor is still busy. The festivals are still being celebrated. The neighbors are still eating dinner, still arguing about politics, still going about the 10,000 small tasks of daily life. Only they are not part of it anymore. They have been excised from it as cleanly as a surgeon removes a diseased limb, and they must now figure out what it means to exist without the thing they had always assumed was simply the ground beneath their feet. Diogenes walked toward Athens. This was the obvious destination, the place that functioned in the Greek world as a kind of magnetic pole for the displaced, the ambitious, the intellectual, the desperate. Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era was at the height of its cultural and philosophical vitality. Socrates had lived and died there a generation before, and his death, that strange, stubborn insistence on asking uncomfortable questions until the city put him on trial for it, had seeded the ground from which an extraordinary garden of philosophical schools was now growing. Plato had founded his academy on the outskirts of the city. Aristotle was teaching there. The ideas being generated and debated in Athens in those decades would shape the course of Western thought for the next 2 millennia and beyond. But Diogenes did not go to Athens because he was in search of philosophy. Not yet. He went to Athens because it was where you went when you had nowhere else to go, when you needed the anonymity and the economic possibilities that only a great city could offer. The road from Sinope to Athens would have taken weeks. Through the mountains of Anatolia, across to the coast, passage by ship, an uncomfortable, salt-soaked, uncertain passage to the Greek mainland, and then the last overland stretch to the city itself. What did he think about on that long road? Did he rehearse explanations and justifications? Did he feel, at moments, the lightness that sometimes accompanies the stripping away of everything, the strange freedom of having nothing left to lose? Or was he simply numb, putting one foot in front of the other with the mechanical persistence of someone who has not yet been able to fully absorb what has happened to him? He arrived in Athens carrying, in all likelihood, very little. A man in his situation, exiled, disgraced, his family's assets seized, would not have had access to significant funds. He was, in practical terms, poor. And poverty in a Greek city was a specific, visible, somewhat humiliating condition. The poor were not invisible the way that modern urban poverty can sometimes render people invisible to those who pass them on the street. In the ancient agora, in the ancient marketplace, everyone saw everyone. The social hierarchy was entirely legible. You could tell, by a man's clothing, by the quality of his sandals, by whether he had a slave accompanying him, by the cuts of meat he was purchasing and the wine he could afford, exactly where he stood in the social order. A newcomer with no connections, no family name recognizable in this city, no trade established. Such a person was at the very bottom of the social structure, dependent on the charity of strangers and on whatever work he could find. It was in Athens that Diogenes first encountered the man who would redirect the trajectory of his life, a philosopher named Antisthenes. Antisthenes was, in his own way, already something of a radical. He had been a student of Socrates, one of the inner circle who had witnessed the old man's trial and death, and he had drawn from that experience a set of philosophical conclusions that set him apart from Plato and the other Socratic inheritors. Where Plato was constructing elaborate metaphysical systems, developing his theory of forms, founding an academy that drew aristocratic young men eager for cultivation and intellectual prestige, Antisthenes was moving in a sharply different direction. He was teaching in the Cynosarges, a gymnasium outside the city walls, a detail that was symbolically significant because the Cynosarges was traditionally the place where those of mixed or uncertain citizenship gathered, those who did not quite belong to the full civic body of Athens. Antisthenes was deliberately positioning himself and his teachings outside the established social order. The philosophy he was developing would later be called cynicism, from the Greek word for dog, kainos, though the exact origin of the name is disputed. Some say it came from the Cynosarges gymnasium. Others say it was applied to his followers as an insult, a reference to their dog-like disregard for social convention, and that they simply accepted the label and wore it proudly. Either way, the philosophy centered on a radical simplicity. Antisthenes argued that virtue, the Greek concept of arete, of human excellence, was not found in wealth or social status or intellectual achievement, but in the alignment of one's life with nature. He distrusted pleasure. He distrusted convention. He was suspicious of the elaborate social machinery that organized Greek city life, the hierarchies of class and wealth, the obsession with reputation and honor, the assumption that comfort and ease were goods worth pursuing. He advocated for a life stripped down to its essentials, lived in accordance with reason and nature rather than custom and desire. When Diogenes appeared and expressed a desire to study with him, Antisthenes was reportedly dismissive. The ancient sources include a famous anecdote. Antisthenes, perhaps recognizing in this rough, displaced newcomer someone whose intentions he doubted, raised his staff to strike him. And Diogenes, without flinching, said simply, "Strike me, for there is no stick hard enough to drive me away while you have something to say." Whether this exchange happened precisely this way is impossible to verify. Ancient philosophical biographies are full of such perfectly crystallized moments, stories that may be more legendary than literal, designed to capture in a single scene some essential truth about the person being described. But the truth it captures rings authentic. Something in Diogenes was already reaching toward something. Something in him was already open, already hungry, already cracked open by what had happened to him in Sinope in a way that made him unusually receptive to radical ideas. Because here is the thing about catastrophe, about exile, about the sudden, violent dissolution of everything you thought was solid and permanent. It can destroy a person entirely, and often does. But sometimes, in the rare individual with the right combination of intelligence and psychological resilience, and what we might now call a certain capacity for meaning-making, it does something else. It creates a kind of devastating clarity. When you lose everything, you are forced to ask a question that comfortable people almost never ask, because they never have to. What was actually valuable in all of that? What was real? And what was merely the decoration and convention and habit accumulated over years of ordinary life? What did I actually need, and what was I merely afraid to be without? Diogenes, in the ruins of his former life, was beginning to ask these questions. And what he was discovering, slowly, through his encounters with Antisthenes and through his own observation of Athenian life around him, was a deeply uncomfortable answer. He was discovering that most of what people valued, most of what they organized their entire lives around acquiring and protecting and displaying, the money, the status, the fine clothing, the large house, the respectful greetings in the marketplace, the political connections, the carefully managed reputation, most of it was, in his emerging view, not merely unnecessary but actively harmful. It was not simply that these things were insufficient for happiness. It was that the pursuit of them was itself a kind of enslavement, a trap so well disguised as freedom that almost no one noticed the bars. He watched the people of Athens go about their days. He watched them scheme for political advantage and fret about what their neighbors thought of them and work exhausting hours to maintain lifestyles that required ever more exhausting work to sustain. He watched them sacrifice genuine ease and genuine thought and genuine human connection on the altar of the appearance of ease, of the performance of respectability, of the maintenance of an identity built from possessions and associations and carefully managed impressions. And he thought about Sinope. He thought about how, in a single day, all of that could be stripped away, was stripped away from him, entirely without his consent, and how, in the aftermath, the world had not ended. He had not ended. He was still breathing, still thinking, still hungry and tired and curious and alive. And if the world had not ended when he lost everything, then maybe everything was not what it appeared to be. Maybe the whole system of values that organized Greek civic life was built on something much less solid than it seemed. This is the moment, not a single dramatic moment, but a long, slow, grinding process of thought and observation and personal experiment, when Diogenes began to become Diogenes. Not the exile from Sinope, not the disgraced banker's son, not the newcomer seeking anonymity in a great city, but the philosopher, the cynic, the dog, the man who would spend the rest of his life performing philosophy in the most visceral and public and confrontational way imaginable, using his own body and his own behavior as the instrument of his argument, living his ideas rather than merely articulating them. He began to strip away, not all at once. The process was gradual, each step following from the previous one with a kind of inexorable logic. He gave up his rented lodgings. He had little money for them anyway, and began to sleep in more temporary arrangements, moving between the porticos of temples and public buildings. He reduced his possessions. The ancient sources describe an instructive moment. He saw a child drinking water from cupped hands, and he threw away his wooden bowl. If a child could drink without a bowl, why did he need one? It sounds almost trivial, a gesture of unnecessary asceticism, until you understand what it represented in the philosophical framework he was constructing. Every possession, he was beginning to argue, was not merely a physical object but a psychological one, an attachment, a vulnerability, a chain binding you to the fear of loss. The more you had, the more you could lose. The more you could lose, the more you lived in anxiety about losing it. And anxiety about loss was the opposite of freedom. He had learned this the hard way in Sinope. He had had a house and a name and a father's business and a place in a community, and all of it had been taken from him in a moment, and he had survived. The lesson he drew from that survival was not gratitude for what remained, but suspicion of everything he might be tempted to accumulate again. He found the large clay pot, a pithos, the kind of large ceramic storage vessel used to hold grain or wine or oil, that would become, eventually, his most famous address. It was not, in all likelihood, a perfectly sealed and comfortable dwelling. It was a storage jar, probably discarded or repurposed, set somewhere in or near the Athenian agora. He slept in it when it was cold. He sat beside it when the weather was fine. He lived, in short, in the street, but with a single fixed point, a single object that served as home in the most minimal possible sense of that word. And he made no apology for it. He did not present his poverty as a misfortune to be escaped, but as a choice to be celebrated, or rather, not even celebrated, because celebration was too social a gesture, too concerned with the opinions of others. He simply lived it, matter-of-factly, as if the idea that there was any other way to live was the strange and puzzling position requiring explanation. He acquired a reputation. In Athens, you could not live as Diogenes was living without acquiring a reputation, because Athens was a city organized around visibility, around public life, around the agora where everything happened in full view of everyone. The agora was not merely a commercial space, but a social and political and intellectual one. It was where citizens gathered, where informal debates were conducted, where philosophical teaching happened, where news was exchanged and opinions formed. It was, in a sense, the city's mind, its collective consciousness, the place where Athens thought and talked and argued with itself. And into this space, Diogenes inserted himself as a permanent and increasingly impossible to ignore provocation. He would eat in the agora, itself a violation of social convention, because eating in public was considered inappropriate, something done in private, in the home, with family and invited guests. He did it pointedly, deliberately, as a kind of demonstration. What is shameful about feeding the body? He would ask. The body needs food. Food is natural. Why should the natural be hidden? And if you do not have a home to eat in, because you have given up the pretense that a home is necessary, then where else should you eat? He was testing every assumption, every convention, every unexamined rule of social behavior, applying to it the simplest and most disruptive of questions. Why? He developed the practice that the ancient sources describe as his characteristic mode of philosophical engagement, the crii, the short, pointed, often devastating verbal exchanges that he deployed in encounters with passers-by, with other philosophers, with powerful men, with anyone who came within range of his attention. These were not polished, rhetorical performances designed to impress an audience. They were weapons, blunt, fast, aimed at the weak points in his interlocutor's self-presentation. He was hunting, always, for the gap between what people claimed to be and what they actually were, between the life they professed to value and the life they were actually living. And he had an extraordinary instinct for finding that gap. He would call out to passing strangers, engaging them in conversations that began with apparent normality and then veered, with the speed and precision of a thrown stone, into something entirely uncomfortable. He would compliment a man on his fine cloak and then ask him, with apparent sincerity, whether the fine cloak had made him any happier today than he had been before he acquired it, and whether he thought he would be less happy if he had to give it back tomorrow. He would watch a politician being attended to by a crowd of admirers and approach him with a question about what precisely he had done, in his years of power, to make the people of Athens wiser or more virtuous, and then listen with ostentatious patience to the politician's self-justifying answer before pointing out, calmly, that the number of people in Athens who were wiser or more virtuous seemed to have remained fairly stable regardless of the administration. He was not performing for applause. This is important to understand, because later generations would sometimes mistake Diogenes for a showman, someone who had discovered that outrageous behavior attracted attention and had simply decided to monetize the attention by positioning himself as a philosopher. This misunderstands him completely. The performances, and they were performances in the sense that they were deliberate, public, and designed to produce an effect, were in service of a genuine philosophical argument. The argument was that the way virtually everyone around him was living was wrong. Not wrong in the way that violating a social rule is wrong, but wrong in a deeper, more damaging sense. Wrong in that it was causing actual human suffering, actual unfreedom, actual damage to the capacity of human beings to live well. And if you had seen this, if you had really, clearly, with the force of personal experience behind it, seen this, and if you had any genuine commitment to honesty, then simply continuing to say nothing, simply sitting quietly in a philosophical school and writing careful treatises about virtue while the people around you went on destroying themselves through their own misguided values. That would be the real moral failure. He was, in this sense, the most honest man in Athens. Or at least, that was his argument about himself, and it was an argument that a surprising number of people found difficult to entirely refute. He encountered Plato. This was inevitable in a city of Athens's intellectual dimensions. Plato was the dominant philosophical figure of the age, the inheritor of Socrates' legacy, who had taken that legacy in the direction of grand metaphysical system building, who had founded an institution, who attracted the sons of wealthy families and ambitious men from across the Greek world, who had the ear of powerful people. Diogenes found Plato deeply problematic, not personally, necessarily, but philosophically. Plato's theory of forms, his insistence that reality was to be found not in the world of the senses, but in a separate realm of ideal, unchanging essences. This struck Diogenes as exactly the kind of elaborate abstraction that philosophy used to avoid the actual, concrete, embodied question of how to live. Plato talked about the ideal of the table, the ideal of the good, the ideal of justice. Diogenes, famously, responded, "I can see a table, Plato, but I cannot see your tableness." He attended, apparently, some of Plato's discussions, or at least was present in contexts where Platonic ideas were being aired. And he interrupted. He corrected. He refused to accept the social hierarchy that positioned Plato as the master before whom lesser minds fell silent. He was, to put it plainly, a significant annoyance to Plato, and the feeling appears to have been mutual. Plato reportedly described Diogenes as Socrates gone mad. There is something interesting and almost affectionate in this characterization, a recognition that Diogenes was working in the same tradition as Socrates, asking some of the same fundamental questions, deploying some of the same provocative techniques, while simultaneously being something that Socrates was not. Socrates asked questions, but he also argued. He constructed positions. He engaged in extended, serious philosophical dialogue. Diogenes largely declined to do this. His method was demonstration, not argument. He would show you, with his body and his behavior and his refusal to participate in the rituals you assumed were mandatory, what a life looked like when it took philosophy seriously. He would perform the conclusion and leave you to work out the reasoning for yourself. He claimed, at some point, and this claim would become one of the most distinctive things about him, something that set him entirely apart from the standard Greek understanding of identity and belonging, that he was a citizen of the world. Cosmopolites. A cosmopolitan. Not of Sinope, not of Athens, not of any particular city or people or tribe or nation, but of the cosmos itself, the universal order that contained all of these smaller things. This was a revolutionary statement, and it is worth pausing to appreciate just how revolutionary it was, not merely in its philosophical implications, but in its personal resonance for someone who had lost their city. Exile had stripped him of his citizenship. The response of most exiles to this loss was grief and longing, a desperate wish to return, to be restored to the community from which they had been expelled. Diogenes turned the loss inside out. He declared that the thing which had been taken from him was not worth having. He declared that the category of citizen, of city member, was itself a limitation, a parochialism, an arbitrary division of the human family into competing tribes. And he proposed in its place something vast and radical, the idea that every human being, simply by virtue of being human and rational and capable of moral choice, was a citizen of the same universal community. He was moving now with a kind of intellectual momentum that was impossible to stop, each idea generating the next with the relentlessness of a river finding its course. If he was a citizen of the cosmos rather than of any particular city, then the conventions of any particular city had no claim on him. If the conventions of any particular city had no claim on him, then the shame those conventions defined was not real shame. If the shame those conventions defined was not real shame, then the things that those conventions marked as shameful, eating in public, sleeping in the street, owning nothing, answering the calls of the body without ceremony or privacy, were simply things no more shameful than the same behaviors performed by a dog or a goat, and he had no reason to feel shame about them. And if he had no reason to feel shame about them, then there was no reason not to do them, openly and unapologetically, in full view of everyone. This is the logic that led him to the behaviors that would later make him infamous across the centuries. The public eating, the public urination, the more explicit violations of public decency. Each of them was, in his framework, a perfectly consistent application of the principle that social convention was not the same as natural law, and that the human body, being natural, was not subject to social convention in the way that social behavior was. He was not doing these things for shock value, or rather, the shock value was entirely intentional, but it was in service of a philosophical point. Every time someone cringed or turned away or expressed outrage, they were demonstrating his argument for him. They were demonstrating that they had internalized a set of arbitrary rules so thoroughly that they could no longer distinguish between what was actually harmful and what was merely unconventional. They were demonstrating that they were, in his view, enslaved, not by physical chains, but by shame, by the desperate anxiety about what other people thought of them, by the 10,000 small adjustments and performances and self-censorships that social life required. He had a lantern. During the day, in full, bright Greek sunlight, he would walk through the agora carrying a lit lantern, holding it up to the faces of the people he passed. When they asked him what he was doing, he would say, "I am looking for an honest man." The joke, and it was a joke, but of the kind that has an edge sharp enough to draw blood, was that the light of day was insufficient. That despite all the sun and all the visibility and all the public scrutiny that Athenian life organized itself around, genuine honesty was so rare as to require a lamp to find. He had looked at Athens, at this city that prided itself on its democracy, its culture, its philosophical sophistication, its commitment to reason and virtue, and he had found it wanting. Not in an abstract sense, not as a theoretical proposition to be debated in an academy, but in the concrete, observable, daily sense that the people who lived in it were, by and large, not honest. They were performing honesty. They were performing virtue. They were performing the social role of the respectable Athenian citizen while actually organizing their lives around wealth and status and reputation and pleasure and the avoidance of anything that might disrupt the comfortable surface of their existence. He was merciless in this observation. He was merciless because he had been stripped of the incentive to be polite about it. The social courtesies that kept most people from saying what they actually thought, the need to maintain relationships, to preserve one's standing, to avoid the consequences of giving offense. These had no purchase on him. He had no standing to lose. He had no relationships maintained through courtesy rather than genuine affection. He had no position in the social hierarchy that required protection. He was already at the bottom, or rather, he had decided that the hierarchy did not apply to him, which was a kind of freedom that even the most powerful person in Athens could not claim. Alexander of Macedon, with his armies and his treasuries and his vast conquered territories, was enslaved to his own ambition, to the insatiable appetite for more that drove him across continent after continent. Diogenes, lying in his clay pot with nothing, was enslaved to nothing. And this was his argument, his life's central and most radical claim. That was what it felt like to be free. The encounter with Alexander, which would become perhaps the single most famous moment of Diogenes' life, had not yet happened when he was still in the early stages of this transformation. Alexander was still a young man in Macedon, still in the process of becoming the world historical figure he would become when Diogenes was establishing himself as Athens' most provocative and annoying permanent resident. But the encounter, when it came, would crystallize everything about who Diogenes had become. The absolute refusal of deference, the perfect indifference to power, the serene confidence that the man lying in a clay pot on the ground was in possession of something more valuable than anything the most powerful conqueror in the world could offer him. It would be, in miniature, a demonstration of everything Diogenes had spent his life arguing. But that was still ahead. In the meantime, he lived. He argued. He insulted. He provoked. He ate his figs in the agora and slept in his pot and held his lantern up to the faces of passers-by, looking for his honest man. The sun moved across the sky above Athens, as it had always moved, indifferent to the affairs of kings and philosophers and exiles alike. The Acropolis rose against the blue sky at the city's center, the Parthenon gleaming white and perfect, its sculptured gods gazing serenely over a city of 3,000 or 4,000 years of accumulated human striving and confusion and beauty and cruelty and thought. And in the agora below, a man with a clay pot and a walking staff and a worn cloak and no house and no money and no name worth anything in this city was conducting, day by day, the most radical philosophical experiment in the ancient world. He was asking what a human life was for, not in the abstract, not in the academic, not in the carefully hedged and qualified and footnoted way that professional philosophers ask such questions, but nakedly, publicly, with his body and his breath and his every deliberately unconventional action. He was asking what was real and what was merely agreed upon. He was asking what you kept when you stripped everything away, and whether what remained was more or less than what you had started with. The answers he was arriving at were not comfortable. They were not designed to comfort. They were designed to unsettle, to disturb, to create in the mind of anyone who paused long enough to actually think about them a kind of vertigo. The vertigo of suddenly seeing the ground you have always stood on for what it actually is, which is not solid earth, but an elaborate and largely arbitrary human construction. A web of agreed-upon fictions so pervasive and so long established that they have come to feel like nature itself. He had been exiled from Sinope for corrupting the currency. He had arrived in Athens with nothing. And now, having learned from that loss and from the philosophy of Antisthenes, and from his own long observation of human behavior, he was in the process of corrupting something far larger and far more consequential than the silver coins of a Black Sea port city. He was in the process of corrupting the currency of everything. Every received idea, every social convention, every unexamined assumption about what a good life looked like and what it meant to be a human being living rightly in the world. He was just beginning. The most extreme gestures, the most memorable confrontations, the most profound demonstrations of his philosophy, all of it was still ahead. He was still, in these early years in Athens, finding his way into the fullness of what he would become. Still learning to trust the radical simplicity that his experience had taught him was not poverty, but something much closer to the opposite. Still discovering the strange, austere satisfaction of a life lived entirely without pretense, without performance, without the exhausting maintenance of a self built from the opinions of others. And somewhere on the road he was walking, in the bright and crowded marketplace where he ate his breakfast in the open air while the respectable citizens of Athens looked away in discomfort, in the clay pot where he arranged himself for sleep with the pragmatic ease of a man who had long since stopped missing the things he used to miss, in the accumulated weight of every deliberate act of rejection and every carefully aimed insult and every moment of genuine and total indifference to consequences. In all of this, something was crystallizing. Something was becoming more fully itself. A man was becoming a philosophy. A philosophy was becoming a life. And a life, lived at this particular extreme of simplicity and honesty and radical freedom, was becoming something that the ancient world, for all its philosophical sophistication and all its accumulated wisdom, had never quite seen before that he had corrupted the coinage. He would spend the rest of his life corrupting everything else. And he would do it in full public view, with nothing to hide and nothing to lose and nothing to prove except the one thing he believed needed proving above all others: that a human being, stripped of every comfort and every convention and every last thread of the social contract, could still live, in fact, more fully and more freely than any of the comfortable, respectable, conventionally successful people who watched him with their mixture of contempt and horrified fascination and secret, deeply suppressed envy. The sun was moving across Athens. The lantern was lit. The pot was waiting. And Diogenes was just getting started. The lantern was not merely a prop. This is the first thing to understand about it, and perhaps the most important. A lesser man. A man who was performing philosophy rather than living it. A man who had calculated the theatrical effect and decided it would serve his reputation, would have carried the lantern for a week, perhaps two, until the joke had circulated sufficiently through the city and enough people had heard about it to constitute an audience. And then he would have put the lantern down and moved on to the next provocation. Diogenes carried it for years. He carried it on cold mornings when the agora was half empty and there was no audience to perform for, when the only people in the marketplace were bakers setting out their bread and water carriers making their first rounds, and the occasional insomniac philosopher staring at the sky. He carried it on afternoons when it had rained and the streets were wet and the light was flat and gray, and there was no particular drama in the gesture, no contrast between the flame and the surrounding darkness to make the image striking. He carried it because he meant it, because he genuinely, sincerely, with the full weight of his philosophical conviction, believed that an honest man was difficult to find, and that the constant, unglamorous, day after day looking, was not a rhetorical gesture but an actual practice. An honest man was worth finding. The search was worth conducting, even if it never ended in discovery. He moved through the agora in those years with a quality of attention that people found both compelling and unsettling. He watched. He watched the way a man's behavior changed depending on whether he thought he was being observed. He watched the gap between what people said in public and what their faces betrayed about what they were actually thinking. He watched the small, constant negotiations of social life, the deferential tilt of the head before a wealthy man, the slight quickening of pace when passing someone of lower status, the careful calibration of the smile, more or less warm depending on the rank of the person receiving it. He watched all of this with the focused, dispassionate attention of a naturalist observing animal behavior, and what he saw confirmed, every day, in 100 small ways, the central argument of his philosophy, that the people around him were not living. They were performing living, and performing it for an audience that was itself performing, in a vast and mutually sustaining hall of mirrors in which no one was actually looking at anything real. He began to engage more aggressively with the philosophers. Athens was full of them, not just Plato and his academy, but the full spectrum of intellectual life that a great city generates. The sophists with their rhetorical training and their fees, the itinerant teachers who set up in the stoas and the gymnasiums and attracted followings of various sizes, the self-appointed wise men and the genuine seekers, and everyone in between. Diogenes had opinions about all of them, and unlike most people with opinions, he expressed them directly to the faces of the people he was opining about. He found the sophists particularly contemptible. These men who charged money to teach the art of argument, who trained young aristocrats to win debates regardless of whether they were right or wrong, who had made of language itself a commodity to be sold and a weapon to be wielded without any particular regard for truth. He called them the executioners of time, men who took the most precious and limited resource a human being possessed, the hours of their living, and wasted it on teaching tricks rather than pursuing wisdom. He attended a lecture by one of the more celebrated sophists, a man renowned for the elegance of his speech, the sophistication of his arguments, the way he could make virtually any position seem reasonable through sheer rhetorical dexterity. The hall was full. Wealthy young Athenians were present in numbers, their fine cloaks arranged just so, their expressions composed into the particular look of men who are paying attention in a way that they want other people to notice. The sophists spoke for a long time and with considerable skill on the subject of virtue, what it was, how it might be taught, how it related to success in public life. When he finished, there was appreciative murmuring from the audience, the sound of men who felt they had gotten value for their attendance. Diogenes, who had been sitting somewhere near the back, said nothing for a moment. And then, in the quiet that followed the murmuring, he asked a single question. If virtue can be taught, why are none of your students more virtuous than they were before? The silence that followed was of a different quality from the appreciative murmuring. It was the silence of a question that has found the gap in the armor, and the armor has clanged shut too late. He ate. This is worth returning to. because the public eating was not merely a once or twice transgression of social norms, but a consistent practice that he maintained deliberately and without apology throughout his years in Athens. He ate in the agora in the morning, whatever he had, bread given to him by a baker who had come to find his presence there acceptable, or figs from a vendor who had stopped trying to move him along, or occasionally something more substantial when someone who had been thinking about his ideas decided, in a momentary flush of philosophical sympathy, to bring him a meal. He ate slowly, without apparent self-consciousness, with the focused appreciation of someone who had learned to experience simple food as something genuinely good rather than as a consolation for the absence of better food. This was part of his argument, too. That pleasure, properly understood, was available in the simplest things, and that the elaborate, expensive machinery of aristocratic dining, the multiple courses, the imported wines, the reclining couches, the flute girls, the whole performance of wealth at table, added nothing to the actual experience of being nourished and satisfied, and subtracted a great deal from the freedom of the person who had organized their life around maintaining it. A wealthy man passed him once while he was eating, a man of considerable property, recognizable by his dress and the small entourage that accompanied him, the careful hierarchy of attendants and slaves that wealthy Athenians deployed in public as a kind of walking advertisement of their status. The man looked at Diogenes eating on the ground with a mixture of pity and contempt that is a particularly hard mixture to sustain simultaneously, because pity requires seeing the other person as suffering, while contempt requires not caring very much that they are, and the combination tends to resolve itself into a kind of embarrassed looking away. The wealthy man almost looked away, but something made him pause, perhaps genuine curiosity, perhaps the intellectual honesty to at least ask what this man's situation actually was. And he said to Diogenes, or to the air near Diogenes, something to the effect that it was a pity to see a man of apparent intelligence reduced to eating in the street. Diogenes looked up. He looked at the entourage, the slaves, the attendants, the people whose entire existence was organized around the service and comfort of this one man. He looked back at the man himself, and he said, I think the pity runs in the other direction. You cannot eat without all of this. I can eat anywhere. The wealthy man left. Whether he was amused or stung, whether the remark lodged itself somewhere and kept working in the quiet of his evenings, whether he told the story at dinner that night in a tone of dismissal or with a small, private concession that the filthy man in the marketplace had a point, none of this is recorded. The ancient sources are interested in Diogenes, not in the people he deflated. But the people he deflated were real, and they went home to their real lives, and they thought their real thoughts in the privacy of their comfortable houses, and some of them, not all, not most, but some, found that the encounter with Diogenes had left something behind. Not a conversion, not a sudden abandonment of wealth and comfort, but a small persistent irritation, like a splinter you cannot quite locate, which is the beginning of genuine thought. He was extraordinarily skilled at identifying the specific form of hypocrisy most characteristic of each individual he encountered. He had, it seems, an almost preternatural ability to read people, to see through the surface presentation to the actual motivations and anxieties and self-deceptions beneath, and then to name them, directly and without softening, in ways that were impossible to dismiss as mere insult because they were too precisely accurate. A man who was publicly pious but privately avaricious, who made generous sacrifices at the temples and spent the rest of his time in aggressive commercial maneuvering. Diogenes would observe him performing some act of public religious devotion and then ask, with apparently genuine curiosity, whether the gods were likely to be satisfied by offerings from a man who had that very morning cheated a merchant from Corinth. The question was unanswerable. It was unanswerable because answering it required either admitting to the cheating, which was socially impossible, or denying the relevance of private conduct to public piety, which was theologically impossible, or claiming that the cheating had not in fact occurred, which was logistically difficult given that several witnesses had been present. So the pious, avaricious man said nothing and walked away, and Diogenes watched him go with the calm, interested expression of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis. He did not make friends easily. This is perhaps an understatement. The kind of honesty Diogenes practiced was not socially generative. It did not create the warm bonds of mutual flattery and shared comfortable illusion on which most human relationships are founded. The people who were drawn to him were people who could tolerate a great deal of discomfort, who were genuinely more interested in the truth than in maintaining a pleasant fiction about themselves, who could absorb the impact of his directness without flinching and come back for more. There were some. There were always some. The ancient sources mention followers, students in the loosest sense, men who came to sit near him in the agora and listen to what he said and watch what he did and try to understand the logic beneath the apparent madness. Some of them tried to emulate him. Some managed it for a few weeks before retreating to their comfortable houses and the warm bath and the proper meal. A few persisted. Crates of Thebes would come later. A wealthy young man who would eventually give away his considerable fortune and take up the life of a wandering cynic philosopher, one of the most genuine and wholehearted of all the people who drew inspiration from Diogenes. But even in these earlier years, there were those who circled, drawn by the magnetic force of someone who had found a way to mean exactly what they said and say exactly what they meant and live in complete alignment with their stated values, which is far rarer in any era than it should be, and which exercises a pull on people precisely because it is so rare. He had a gift for the aphorism that was almost physical in its precision, the ability to compress an entire philosophical argument into a sentence short enough to throw, like a stone, and accurate enough to land exactly where it was aimed. When asked why he was called a dog, he said, "Because I fawn on those who give me things, bark at those who refuse, and bite scoundrels." The self-characterization was disarming in its honesty, no pretense at dignity, no claim to a higher status than the animal comparison. He accepted the epithet and explained it on his own terms. The cynics, the dog philosophers, the school he was in the process of creating or rather embodying, for it was his life that was the school, his behavior that was the curriculum, would keep this animal identification as a badge of honor. The dog was honest. The dog made no pretense about its nature or its desires. The dog ate when it was hungry and slept when it was tired and responded to affection with affection and to threat with warning and to genuine attack with genuine defense, all of it without calculation or performance or shame. In the dog, Diogenes saw something closer to the natural life he was pursuing than in any human being he had observed. He lived with the dogs, too, in some sense, not literally, not as a member of a pack, but with the same relationship to the physical world that the dogs of Athens had. The dogs moved through the city freely, belonging to no one, existing at the margins of human society without being truly part of it, sleeping in whatever sheltered spot was available, eating whatever was offered or found, observed by everyone and claimed by no one. Diogenes found this condition not degrading but clarifying. The dog had no reputation to maintain, no property to protect, no position in any hierarchy of honor that could be damaged by sleeping in the wrong place or eating the wrong thing. The dog simply was, and went on being, with a directness and an economy that Diogenes increasingly found more admirable than anything the human social world produced. He argued, and this was one of his most consistently radical claims, that labor saving was the purpose of civilization, but that civilization had somehow managed to produce more labor, not less. A man who lived simply needed almost nothing and spent almost no time or energy acquiring it. A man who had been captured by civilization's promises of comfort needed to work constantly, to maintain his house, his clothing, his social position, the appearance of the kind of life that society told him was worth living, and could never stop working because the requirements of the lifestyle were always just slightly beyond what he had already achieved. The horizon of comfortable sufficiency kept moving. It had always just moved a little further ahead, and the life spent running toward it was not a free life, regardless of what the man running told himself about his own autonomy. He demonstrated this in practical terms with an almost perverse consistency. He required so little: a piece of bread, access to water, the clay pot to sleep in when the weather required shelter, the cloak that served simultaneously as garment by day and blanket by night, that the portion of his day spent acquiring necessities was genuinely tiny. The rest of his time was his own, entirely and absolutely. He spent it thinking, observing, arguing, walking, sitting in the sun with the easy contentment of a creature that has no obligations it has not chosen. The aristocrats who passed him and pitted his poverty were spending their days in management and anxiety, managing their estates, their slaves, their investments, their political relationships, the endless social obligations that came with being a person of property in a city that ran on reciprocal favors and carefully tracked debts of honor. They were not free. They were the most elaborately imprisoned people in the city, and their prison was made of everything they owned. There was a period, and the ancient sources hint at this rather than detailing it, when Diogenes' challenge to social convention became more systematic, more comprehensive, more deliberately structured as a total philosophical program. It was not enough, he seems to have concluded, to demonstrate individual violations of individual norms. That could be dismissed as eccentricity, as the behavior of a damaged man who had lost his social bearings in exile and never properly recovered them. He needed to make clear that the violations were principled, that each one was derived from a coherent philosophical position, that he was not failing to meet social expectations, but consciously and deliberately rejecting them on the basis of a reasoned critique of what those expectations actually were and what they served. He needed, in other words, to be understood not as a failure, but as a refusal. And so he began to speak more, to explain more, though never in the formal, extended way that Plato or Aristotle would explain. His explanations were always embedded in action, always immediate, always responsive to whatever was happening around him in the moment. He was not a lecturer. He was an improviser, working with the material that the city itself provided, using the actual people and situations and accidents of daily Athenian life as the text that his philosophy glossed and interpreted. The city was his academy. The agora was his lecture hall. And every interaction, every curious stranger, every offended patrician, every bewildered tourist who had heard about the famous madman of Athens and come to look, was a seminar in which he was both teacher and text. He was captured once. This is recorded in the ancient sources with the kind of matter-of-fact brevity that suggests it was considered worth mentioning, but not worth dwelling on, an incident rather than a crisis. He was taken prisoner, reportedly, during a voyage, the ancient world being a place where Mediterranean travel carried genuine risks of piracy, where ships were stopped and their passengers sold into slavery with a regularity that the wealthy tried to ignore and the poor had no choice but to accept. He was put up for sale. At the slave market, when asked what he could do, the standard question put to a slave to assess their value, he reportedly replied, "Govern men." And then, pointing to a wealthy-looking Corinthian named Xeniades who was browsing the market, he said, "Sell me to that man. He needs a master." The audacity of this is almost impossible to overstate. A man standing in chains, being sold as a slave, with no rights and no protections and no recourse against whatever fate the marketplace assigned him. And he was conducting himself as though he were the one doing the evaluation. As though the auction were a process by which he was selecting his next employer rather than one in which his body was being transferred as property from one owner to another. Xeniades apparently found this response more interesting than alarming. Or perhaps he was simply the kind of man who found genuine oddity more appealing than straightforwardness, and he bought Diogenes and took him to Corinth. There, by various accounts, Diogenes became tutor to Xeniades' sons and managed the household with what was described as considerable competence, all while continuing to live by his own principles, simply, directly, without deference or flattery, treating his master as an equal in all the ways that mattered while technically remaining his property. The paradox here is not merely biographical. It is philosophical. The man who had made freedom the supreme value, who had argued that the only real slavery was the slavery to desire and convention and the opinion of others, was legally a slave, and was, by most accounts, freer in that condition than the wealthy citizens of Athens who walked past him on the street with their retinues and their carefully maintained reputations. Because freedom, in Diogenes' understanding, was not a legal or political category. It was a condition of the soul. A man whose soul was oriented entirely toward what was genuinely good, toward virtue, toward reason, toward the natural life stripped of artificial dependency, was free regardless of his legal status. A man whose soul was enslaved to appetite, to ambition, to the desperate need for the approval of others, was a slave regardless of how many other human beings he owned. He returned to Athens eventually. The sources are unclear on the precise timing and mechanism of this, whether he was freed, whether he bought his freedom, whether Xeniades simply released him out of a combination of affection and the recognition that you could not really contain someone who was philosophically uncontainable. But he came back. Athens was where he belonged, in the specific sense that it was the city that generated the most interesting and most frustrating versions of everything he was arguing against. Athens was the most cultured, most philosophically sophisticated, most self-consciously civilized city in the Greek world, and it was therefore the place where civilization's pretensions were most elaborately on display and most worth puncturing. Corinth had been interesting. Athens was necessary. He came back, and he found the city as he had left it, or more precisely, he found the city in the state of slightly accelerated motion that all cities exist in. The same fundamental dynamics, the same distribution of wisdom and foolishness and self-deception and occasional genuine insight, but with different faces occupying the same social roles, different names being debated for the same positions of honor and disrepute. He came back, and he resumed his life with the easy continuity of someone who had never really left, because the life he lived was not tied to any particular place the way that normal lives are tied to places. His home was the city, any city, in the most generic and abstract sense. His home was the human agora, the marketplace of ideas and commerce and social performance, wherever it happened to be constituted. He had taken his philosophy with him to Corinth, and he brought it back to Athens, and neither transfer had required him to change anything essential. The city had been talking about him while he was gone. This was inevitable, and in some ways useful. The stories that circulate about a person in their absence are revealing. They show you what aspects of the person have lodged in the public imagination, what has struck people as memorable or disturbing or instructive, what the culture is doing with the material that an unusual life provides. The stories that Athens had been telling about Diogenes in his absence were almost uniformly about his outrageous behavior, his violations of decorum, his impossibly direct speech. The stories that made people laugh were almost always, on closer examination, stories about the exposure of hypocrisy or pretension, stories where the joke was ultimately at the expense of someone who had been too comfortable in their comfortable life, who had forgotten to question the assumptions on which their comfort was built. This told Diogenes something useful. People wanted these questions asked. They found it liberating, even when they found it uncomfortable, to watch someone ask them. They just did not want to ask the questions themselves, because asking them yourself required actually facing the answers. Watching Diogenes ask them allowed you to enjoy the question without being obligated to the answer. He found this cowardly and charming in equal measure. He engaged more directly with the question of death in these years. The Athenians, like most people, treated death as a subject to be approached with a combination of ritual solemnity and careful avoidance. Too serious for casual discussion, too frightening for sustained examination, best addressed through the consolations of religion and philosophy, and then quickly moved on from. Diogenes found this evasion both philosophically sloppy and practically self-defeating. If you do not examine death, you cannot truly examine life, because life is entirely defined by the fact that it ends. The person who has not genuinely confronted their own mortality has not genuinely confronted their own existence, and is therefore making choices about how to live on the basis of an incomplete understanding of what living actually is. This was Diogenes' argument, and he made it in the characteristic way, not through extended philosophical dialogue, but through action, through behavior, through the way he lived with death as a constant, acknowledged, unfrightening presence. He reportedly asked to be buried without ceremony, without a coffin, simply thrown out and left for the animals if no one could be bothered with a proper burial. When shocked people protested that this was an undignified end for a human being, he pointed out that he would not be around to experience the indignity, and that any concern for what happened to his body after he was no longer using it was a form of vanity indistinguishable from caring about your reputation after you were dead. The body, he said, was an instrument. When it was no longer being used by the person who had lived in it, what happened to it was irrelevant. The person would be gone. Why was everyone treating the instrument as though it were the person? He talked about Socrates in these years. Inevitably, since Socrates was the philosophical ancestor whose shadow fell over all of Athens's intellectual life, the martyred philosopher who had become the city's most uncomfortable source of pride and guilt. Everyone in Athens claimed Socrates as an inheritance, as a founder, as a legitimizing ancestor for whatever philosophical position they happened to hold. Plato claimed him. The various Socratic schools each claimed him. Even the sophists, whom Socrates had spent his career critiquing, found ways to appropriate some aspect of his legacy. Diogenes' relationship with the Socratic inheritance was characteristically direct. He thought Socrates had been right about most things and had lived wrongly. He had been right that conventional values were largely empty, right that virtue was the only genuine good, right that the examined life was the only life worth living. But he had also lived in a house, maintained a family, accepted the framework of Athenian civic life even as he criticized it from within. He had, in Diogenes' view, stopped short. He had seen the problem clearly and drawn the logical conclusion about what needed to be done, and then not quite done it. Diogenes would do it. Diogenes was doing it. He was Socrates with the timidity removed, Socrates who had followed the argument all the way to its conclusion without flinching, Socrates who had looked at the house and the family and the participation in civic life and said, "No, if these things are not genuinely good, then I will not maintain them. Even when I could, even when it would be easier, even when everyone around me thinks I am mad." He was building, through this combination of behavior and comment and the accumulated force of a life lived in radical consistency with its stated principles, a reputation that had spread far beyond Athens. He had become, within his own lifetime, something unusual, not merely a philosopher known to other philosophers and to educated elites, but a genuinely public figure, someone whose name and whose stories were recognized across the Greek world, someone whom people traveled to see the way they traveled to see the great monuments or the famous oracles. This was partly the function of Athens as a center of cultural transmission. Things that happened in Athens were talked about in Corinth and Sparta and Thebes and across the Aegean and further. But it was also the specific nature of what Diogenes was doing, which was simultaneously more extreme and more legible than the work of most philosophers. You did not need to have read anything or to understand the technical vocabulary of Greek metaphysics to understand what it meant that a man was living in a jar and telling powerful people that they were wrong. The image was self-explanatory. The argument was embodied. You could grasp it with your eyes before you engaged it with your mind. He was aware of this. He was more self-aware than the image of the deliberately unself-conscious, animal-like philosopher might suggest. He understood that his behavior was being watched, that stories were being told, that he was operating in the public eye in a way that gave him a kind of leverage he could use. He was not naive about this. He used it. He chose his targets, his moments, his modes of engagement with a shrewdness that his apparent wildness tended to disguise. When he insulted someone, he chose someone whose particular form of pretension was widely recognizable and widely resented, so that the insult landed not just on the individual, but on the type, so that everyone who had ever dealt with that type of person felt the satisfaction of seeing them deflated. When he performed some public violation of social norms, he chose violations that were maximally visible and that made his point as clearly as possible, not random acts of social transgression, but precisely calibrated demonstrations of the philosophical argument he was making. He was, for all his apparent chaos, a disciplined and intentional artist. The seasons turned over the agora. The festivals came and went, the great Athenian religious festivals that punctuated the year and organized the city's collective life, the Panathenea with its procession up to the Acropolis, the Dionysia with its theater and its revelry, and its complex relationship to the things that lay beneath the polished surface of civic life. Diogenes watched the festivals with his characteristic mixed attention, appreciating what was genuine in them, the actual human need for collective expression and release that they served, while being entirely skeptical of the elaborate religious apparatus that packaged and channeled that need. He was not particularly pious, which in a world where piety was one of the basic civic obligations was itself a form of radicalism. He did not deny the existence of the gods. He was not that kind of philosopher, not someone interested in the question of whether divine beings existed. He was more interested in the question of what the gods, if they existed, would actually want. And his answer to that question was entirely consistent with his broader philosophy. What the gods would want, if they were genuinely rational and genuinely good, was for human beings to live in accordance with nature and reason, not to perform elaborate and expensive ritual sacrifices on their behalf. The person who thought you could buy divine favor with blood and gold was a person who was projecting onto the gods exactly the kind of bribable, status-conscious, reputation-obsessed psychology that Diogenes found so objectionable in the human beings around him. He tested people's patience beyond what most people found endurable, and he did it deliberately, as part of the philosophical practice. He had a theory about endurance, about what happened when you pushed a human being's tolerance past its comfortable limits and into the zone of genuine discomfort. He believed that what happened in that zone was interesting, that the discomfort stripped away the performed response and revealed something closer to the actual character. A man who was patient and good-humored when things were going smoothly was not demonstrating virtue. He was demonstrating the ability to maintain a pleasant surface under pleasant conditions, which required no particular virtue at all. A man who was patient and good-humored when he had been sitting in the rain for 3 hours having his assumptions challenged by a barefoot philosopher. That man was demonstrating something more interesting. The endurance of real discomfort was Diogenes' test of character, and he applied it relentlessly to everyone he spent time with, including himself. He had developed, over the years, an ascetic practice around the management of his own desires that went far beyond the simple fact of owning very little. He actively sought out difficulty and discomfort, not as a form of masochism. He took no particular pleasure in pain, but as a form of training. He would roll in hot sand in the summer to accustom himself to heat. He would walk barefoot on cold ground in winter. He would fast, not because he thought hunger was good, but because he thought dependency on the satisfaction of any desire was bad, and that the way to reduce that dependency was to demonstrate to yourself, regularly and empirically, that you could survive unsatisfied for longer than you thought you could. Each time he survived a period of discomfort that he had previously found difficult, the hold of that discomfort over him was diminished. The threat of hunger became less threatening when you had been hungry many times and recovered. The threat of cold became less threatening when you had been cold many times and survived. And the threats of poverty, of discomfort, of social rejection, of all the things that people organized their lives to avoid, were precisely what the powerful used to maintain their power, precisely what the wealthy used to prevent the poor from questioning the arrangement, precisely what every social hierarchy required its lower members to be afraid of in order to remain functional. He had made himself unafraid. This was not a pose. This was the actual, lived, tested result of years of deliberate practice in enduring the things that other people feared. And it produced in him a quality that people found simultaneously exhilarating and deeply unsettling. He could not be managed. He could not be threatened, because he had nothing to lose and was unafraid of the physical discomforts that threats generally invoke. He could not be bribed, because he wanted nothing that bribery could offer. He could not be shamed, because shame requires caring about the opinion of the person who is shaming you. And Diogenes' opinion of the opinion of most people was not high enough to allow their judgment to affect him. He was, in the fullest and most complete sense, outside the system of incentives and disincentives by which society normally controls the behavior of its members. And this meant that every time he spoke, it was speech entirely free of the calculations and self-censorships and careful qualifications that most speech is full of. Every time he acted, it was action entirely free of the fear of consequence that shapes most action. He was, in this specific and narrow and important sense, free in a way that almost no one around him was free, and the freedom was visible, was palpable, was something you could feel when you were near him the way you can feel the heat of a fire from several feet away. People responded to this freedom in different ways, as people always respond to things they cannot quite categorize. There were those who dismissed him outright, who decided, quickly and with the comfortable finality that dismissal provides, that he was simply crazy, that the elaborate philosophical justifications for his behavior were post hoc rationalizations for what was fundamentally a damaged person's inability to function in society. This was the easiest response, and it was available only to those who had not actually listened to him carefully, because careful listening tended to produce the uncomfortable recognition that the rationalizations were not post hoc at all, that they were coherent and internally consistent and difficult to argue with, that if you granted his premises, and the premises were not obviously wrong, The conclusions followed with a kind of inexorable logic. The dismissal, when it was honest rather than lazy, tended to focus on the premises. The claim that virtue was the only genuine good, that everything else was merely preferred indifferently, that the natural life was identifiable and achievable and better than the conventional life. These were arguable claims, but they required argument, not dismissal. There were those who responded with rage, genuine, personal, disproportionate-seeming rage that was really the rage of the threatened, the rage that comes when something challenges not just a position you hold, but the entire framework of meanings and values in which you live. These were the people whose commitment to the conventional life was most complete, who had invested most heavily in the system, who had the most to lose if the system turned out to be wrong. A man who had spent 50 years working to accumulate property and status and the respectful greetings of his neighbors did not want to encounter, in the marketplace, a philosophy that said all 50 years had been wasted effort in the service of things that were not worth having. Such a man might feel, in the presence of Diogenes, not just philosophical disagreement, but something more visceral. The vertigo of a life that has been called into question at a fundamental level. The terrifying possibility that the choices that seemed obviously correct and that were validated by everyone around you were, in some important sense, wrong. This rage was honest, in its way. It was the honest response of someone who was actually feeling the force of the challenge rather than dismissing it. And then there were those, fewer, but not negligible, who responded with something that looked like fascination and had, at its core, the quality of recognition. These were the people who had, at some level, already felt the unease that Diogenes was articulating, who had already, in private, late at night, when the performances of daily life had been suspended and they were alone with their thoughts, wondered whether the life they were living was actually the life they wanted, whether the values they were pursuing were actually the values they believed in, whether the whole elaborate structure of their existence was something they had genuinely chosen, or something that had chosen them by default. Diogenes gave these people something they had lacked before, a coherent, lived, embodied demonstration that there was an alternative. Not just a theory, not just a philosophical argument, but a man, a breathing, walking, completely real human being, who was actually doing it. Actually living by principles rather than performing life by convention. Actually free, or at least much closer to freedom than they had ever seen anyone get. The fascination was the fascination of people who have been told that a particular country exists but have never seen it, suddenly encountering a traveler who has been there and come back that he became, in these years, something like a fixture of Athens. Not beloved in the way that figures of general affection become fixtures, but necessary in the way that something necessary and slightly uncomfortable is a fixture. He was the city's conscience in a form the city had not asked for and could not get rid of. He was the question that no one had voted to have asked, but that could not, once it had been asked, be entirely unheard. He was, to use a metaphor that one of his admirers in a later century would employ to describe a different kind of conscience, the gadfly, the small, persistent, impossible to swat insect that keeps interrupting the horse's comfortable sleep and forcing it to pay attention, to move, to be awake. Socrates had used this metaphor for himself. Diogenes would not have used it. It was too modest, too deferential, too much in the tradition of explaining and justifying oneself to an audience whose opinion you were implicitly acknowledging to matter. But the function was real. He was the thing that kept Athens from settling too comfortably into its own satisfied image of itself. He argued constantly, and with anyone who would engage, or, frequently, with people who had not decided to engage but found themselves engaged anyway because they had the misfortune of walking near him while he was in an argumentative mood. He argued about wealth, about its relationship to happiness, about whether the evidence of his own life, happy, or at least content, or at the very minimum entirely unafraid, despite owning nothing, constituted a refutation of the assumption that wealth and happiness were positively correlated. He argued about education, about what it was for, and whether the Athenian version of it was achieving its stated purposes. He argued about politics, about democracy, about whether the assembled citizens of Athens voting on questions of war and peace and taxation were significantly wiser in aggregate than they were individually, which was his own, consistently low assessment of aggregate human wisdom. He argued about love, about the family, about the institutions of marriage and legitimacy and inheritance that organized human reproduction and its consequences. He had views on all of it, and the views were consistent with each other in the way that positions derived from a single coherent set of premises tend to be consistent. They all flowed from the same source, the same basic philosophical commitment to the natural life, the rational life, the life stripped of artificial constraint and conventional deception. He was well into the most productive and extreme phase of his philosophical life, when the world began to change in ways that would eventually, inevitably, bring him into contact with a force that made everything he had been dealing with in Athens look small. The change came from the north, from Macedon, from a dynasty that had seemed to many Greeks to be a peripheral, semi-barbaric monarchy, notable mainly for its military effectiveness and its occasional interference in the always complicated political affairs of the city-states. Philip II of Macedon had been systematically expanding his power and influence for decades, through military conquest, through diplomatic manipulation, through strategic marriage alliances, through the patient accumulation of leverage over city after city across northern Greece and beyond. Athens had been watching this expansion with the mixture of alarm, denial, and political paralysis that characterizes democracies confronting threats that require difficult, collective responses. Demosthenes was delivering his thundering speeches warning about Philip. Other voices were counseling accommodation. The assembly debated. Philip expanded. The Battle of Chaeronea, in 338 BCE, resolved the debate. Philip's forces met a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens and Thebes, and defeated them comprehensively. It was not just a military defeat. It was the end of an era, the moment when the Greek city-states lost the effective independence they had maintained for centuries and became part of a larger political structure organized by Macedonian power. Athens continued to function, continued to hold its assemblies and conduct its daily life, continued to think of itself as Athens. But it was Athens within a Macedonian order, and everyone knew it, even if not everyone was willing to say it. Diogenes watched this. He watched the panic before Chaeronea, the political arguments, the mobilization, the defeat, the aftermath. He watched the Athenians try to come to terms with what it meant, watching the scrambling for accommodation and the performance of dignified acceptance and the private grief of people who had genuinely believed in the city's independence. And he was characteristically unmoved, not because he did not care about human suffering. He was not indifferent to suffering, despite everything his manner might suggest, but because he had never believed in the city-state system in the first place, had never thought that the political independence of Athens was the foundation on which human dignity rested. The city had already lost what Diogenes thought actually mattered: the independence of mind, the freedom from convention, the ability to live in accordance with reason rather than custom. The political independence was a separate and, in his view, secondary thing. Athens had been conquered by Philip. Athens had been conquered by its own values decades before Philip arrived. Philip died, killed by an assassin, in the way that powerful men so often met their ends in the ancient world, where the accumulation of power concentrated the incentives for violence in proportion to the power accumulated. His son inherited the kingdom. The son was 20 years old, had been educated by Aristotle himself, tutored by the greatest systematic philosopher of the age, trained in rhetoric and logic and natural science and political philosophy and the art of governance, and was possessed of an ambition that made his father's ambitions look modest. His name was Alexander. The news of Alexander spread the way that news of genuinely exceptional individuals spreads, faster than events, ahead of the man himself, carried by travelers and merchants and soldiers and the general motion of people through a connected world. He was not merely militarily capable, people said. He was extraordinary. He believed himself, genuinely and not merely as a political posture, to be the descendant of gods, of Achilles on his mother's side, of Heracles, of Zeus himself. He was personally brave to a degree that his generals found alarming, the kind of bravery that leads a commander to put himself at the point of the spear rather than directing from a safe distance. He was intelligent, genuinely and substantially intelligent, the kind of intelligence that can hold vastly complicated logistical and political and military problems simultaneously in mind and find solutions that lesser minds could not reach. And he was ambitious with a scope and a quality that the Greek world had not previously encountered. not the ordinary ambition of a king who wants to expand his territory or secure his borders, but something that pointed toward the horizon of the world itself, something that seemed to have no upper limit and no final destination. Athens felt him before it saw him. It felt him in the changed quality of the political conversations, in the way that previously confident voices began to hedge their positions slightly, in the new careful attention paid to Macedonian movements and intentions, in the sense that the comfortable distances that had always separated the city-states from one another and from the great powers to the north and east were collapsing. The world was getting smaller, or rather, a single human ambition was getting large enough to encompass the world, and the world was beginning to notice. Diogenes noticed. He noticed in his particular way, not with the alarm of the politician whose power was threatened, not with the outrage of the patriot whose city's independence was being eroded, but with the focused attention of a philosopher who recognized that the arrival of Alexander in history presented him with an opportunity that had not previously existed. Because Alexander was not merely a new political fact to be accommodated. Alexander was, from Diogenes' perspective, the supreme example of everything he had been arguing against for decades. The most extreme version of the desire for status and power and the approval of others. The most comprehensive possible expression of the conviction that external conquest could provide what only internal virtue could actually supply. Alexander was, in short, the greatest philosophical case study that the world had ever produced, and he was moving in the direction of Athens. People were beginning to say, quietly, in the careful way that people discuss powerful men they have not yet decided whether to fear or admire, that Alexander wanted to visit Diogenes. This was not as strange as it might seem. Alexander was educated, was genuinely interested in philosophy, had spent years under the instruction of Aristotle, and had absorbed from that instruction not just knowledge but a genuine respect for the life of the mind. He had a collector's instinct for exceptional things and exceptional people. He had heard the stories, everyone had heard the stories, about the man in Athens who lived in a clay pot and told kings they were doing it wrong. And something in him, some combination of genuine curiosity and the competitive spirit that could not see anything unusual without wanting to engage it, had decided that he wanted to see this man, wanted to stand in front of him, wanted to take the measure of him. The word moving through Athens now was not rumor, but something more solid, confirmed reports, specific timelines, the actual logistics of Alexander's itinerary, which was bringing him south through Greece on his way toward the east, and the Persian campaign that everyone could now see was the intended direction of his ambition. He would be passing through. He would be near Corinth, or perhaps in Corinth, holding the ceremonial congress of the Greek states that would legitimize his leadership of the coming campaign. And from there, it was not far to Athens. From there, with the right motivation, and the motivation apparently existed, a detour was eminently possible. The city was vibrating with the knowledge of this approach. Not everyone felt it in the same way. Politicians felt it as a strategic variable to be managed. Merchants felt it as a potential economic event. Soldiers felt it as a question about what came next, where the armies were going, what was being asked of them. Philosophers felt it as something harder to name. The arrival of Alexander was the arrival of history in its most concentrated form, the arrival of a moment that everyone could feel, even without being able to articulate exactly what they were feeling, was going to be one of those moments that divided time into before and after. Something was about to happen, something that had been building for years, in the ambitions of a Macedonian king, in the military campaigns that had reorganized the Greek world, in the slow convergence of two entirely different and entirely incompatible philosophical positions about what a good human life looked like, was about to reach its culmination. Diogenes, in the agora of Athens, sat in the pale light of an autumn afternoon and held his lantern up to the face of a passing stranger. The flame guttered slightly in a breeze off the sea. The stranger squinted, confused, and asked the question that strangers always asked, "What are you looking for?" And Diogenes gave the answer he had given 1,000 times before, in a voice entirely without drama. The voice of a man who has made peace with the fact that the answer will always be the same and the search will never end. An honest man. But something was different now in the way he sat. Something was different in the quality of his stillness. He was a man who had spent decades making himself unafraid, who had tested himself against hunger and cold and shame and loss, and the full spectrum of discomforts that human beings spend their lives avoiding, and had come through all of them with his philosophical convictions intact and his equanimity undisturbed. He was a man who had looked at Athenian society and found it wanting, who had looked at wealth and found it empty, who had looked at political power and found it an elaborate trap, and who had said so, consistently and without softening, to anyone who would listen and many who would rather not. And now something was coming toward him that was larger than anything Athens had produced, larger than any politician he had deflated, or any sophist he had embarrassed, or any wealthy merchant he had sent away without the comfortable validation they had perhaps half-consciously been seeking. Something was coming toward him from the north that had conquered territories and armies, and the political will of a dozen city-states, and the carefully constructed strategic visions of the most sophisticated military and diplomatic minds in the Greek world. Something was coming that had been taught by Aristotle and had exceeded its teacher in the sheer scope of its ambitions and the sheer force of its will. The lantern burned. The afternoon light moved across the agora. The city went about its 10,000 daily businesses, unaware or only dimly aware that something was converging on it, that the long trajectory of a philosopher's life and the even longer trajectory of a conqueror's ambition were approaching an intersection that both the philosopher and the conqueror had, in their different ways and for their different reasons, been moving toward for years. Diogenes lowered the lantern. He looked at the empty space before him, the ordinary, Athenian, sun-soaked, crowded, noisy, philosophically important, historically temporary space of the agora, and he thought whatever it is that a man thinks when he has lived by his convictions for decades and is about to have those convictions tested by the most extreme example of everything he has been arguing against. He was not afraid. He had made himself unafraid, carefully and empirically, and over a very long time, and the work had held. He was not afraid. But he was, and this was perhaps the closest to emotion that the ancient sources ever show him experiencing, the closest to something that might be called anticipation, though Diogenes would never have used that word, would never have admitted to looking forward to anything in a way that implied attachment to an outcome. He was interested, in the way that a philosopher is interested when the world is finally, after decades of preparation, about to ask the question he has been preparing to answer. The clay pot was behind him, at the edge of the agora where he had placed it years ago, and where it had gradually become as much a part of the landscape as the stoas and the altars and the plane trees. The cloak was around his shoulders. The lantern was in his hand. The afternoon was advancing. And somewhere to the north, moving through the Greek world like a tide coming in, was a young man in armor who had been told that the philosopher in the jar was worth seeing, who had decided that he agreed, and who was getting closer with every passing hour. Two worlds were approaching each other. A world of power and conquest and the relentless accumulation of more territory, more cities, more tribute, more glory, more names added to the list of things Alexander had done, and a world of nothing, of deliberately chosen emptiness, of the conviction that less was more in the most radical and comprehensive sense imaginable. A world organized around the principle that what a human being needed was to conquer everything outside them, and a world organized around the principle that what a human being needed was to conquer everything inside them. An irresistible force, and a man who had spent his entire life making himself immovable. Something was about to happen. The city could feel it, even if it could not say precisely what it felt. The light was failing now, the sky over Athens shifting from the gold of late afternoon toward the deeper blue of early evening, the stars beginning to assert themselves above the Acropolis in the way they always did, with the absolute indifference of things that have seen 10,000 Alexanders and 10,000 Diogeneses and know, from long observation, that they all pass, that all of it passes, that the only thing that does not pass is the question itself, the one Diogenes had been carrying in that lantern for decades, the question that would outlast him and outlast Alexander and outlast Athens itself. Who, in all of this, is actually free? Who, in all of this, is actually free? The question did not get an answer in words. It got an answer in the dust of the road leading into Corinth, where the sound reached the city before the army did, a low, continuous rumble that travelers on the highway felt in the soles of their feet before they understood what they were feeling. It got an answer in the way the merchants began closing their stalls early, not from fear exactly, but from the instinct that something was coming that deserved to be watched rather than worked through. It got an answer in the particular quality of anticipation that settles over a city when its citizens know, with absolute certainty, that history is about to walk through their gates in the form of a single young man and the tens of thousands of soldiers who had made him what he was. Alexander had come to Corinth for the Congress, the ceremonial gathering of the Greek states that would confirm him as leader of the great campaign against Persia, the campaign his father had planned and never lived to launch, the campaign that would carry Alexander's name to the edges of the known world and beyond it. The city was full of delegations, full of nervous diplomats from a dozen city-states, each calculating exactly how much deference was required and exactly how much pride could be preserved within that deference. The streets were crowded with soldiers whose discipline was visible in the way they moved, in the economy of their gestures, in the controlled power of men who had marched through mountain passes and broken phalanxes that had stood unbroken for generations. And at the center of it all, receiving delegation after delegation, hearing oath after oath of loyalty and support, sat Alexander, 21 years old now, already a king for several years, already a conqueror in his own right, already wearing the particular stillness of a man who has begun to suspect that the ordinary limits which constrain other human lives may simply not apply to him. He had been told about the philosopher. Multiple people had told him, in fact, in the way that a story which has reached a certain threshold of fame gets told to powerful men by people eager to demonstrate that they know things worth knowing. There is a man in this city, the story went, who owns nothing, who sleeps in an old storage jar near the gymnasium, who insults whoever he wishes, beggars and kings alike, with no apparent distinction between them. He had been called names that Alexander, with his philosophical education under Aristotle, recognized as something more than mere madness. They called him a dog. They called him the cynic. And they said, this was the detail that seems to have actually moved Alexander to action, more than mere curiosity about an eccentric, that this man, when every other citizen and dignitary and visiting notable in Corinth had come to pay homage to the new ruler of the Greek world, had not come, had shown no apparent interest in coming, had remained exactly where he always was, doing exactly what he always did, as if the arrival of the most powerful man alive in his city was simply not a piece of information that required any adjustment to his day. This was, for Alexander, something close to unprecedented. He had spent his entire adult life, and a significant portion of his childhood, in environments structured entirely around his importance. Every room he had ever entered rearranged itself around him. Every conversation calibrated itself to his presence. Every ambition that other men held, they held in some kind of orbit around the question of what Alexander wanted, what Alexander might reward, what Alexander might punish. He had grown up the son of a king and become a king himself, and was in the process of becoming something that did not yet have an adequate word, a man whose power was beginning to exceed the categories that existed to describe power. And somewhere in this city, in a clay pot near a gymnasium, was a man who appeared not to have received the news, or who had received it and found it, in the most literal and complete sense, unremarkable. Alexander decided to go to him. This decision itself tells you something, if you are paying attention to the texture of the moment rather than merely its outcome. Alexander did not summon Diogenes. He could have. The summons of a king to a subject was not a request. It was the ordinary operation of hierarchy, and no one in Corinth, no one in the entire Greek world, after Corinthia, would have considered it strange if Alexander had simply sent soldiers to bring the philosopher before him. But he did not do this. He went himself. He walked, with whatever portion of his retinue and his guard a king of his stature could not entirely shed, even when he wished to, through the streets of Corinth toward the place where the old philosopher was said to spend his days. And in this single choice, to go rather than to summon, there is already a kind of concession, though Alexander could not have fully recognized it as such at the time. He was treating Diogenes as someone whose presence was worth crossing the city for. He was treating him, in other words, as something other than an ordinary subject. He was treating him, whether he knew it or not, as something closer to an equal. The walk through Corinth would have taken some time. The city was busy, full of the particular electric noise that surrounds a historical congress, soldiers, diplomats, merchants capitalizing on the temporary population surge, citizens trying to catch glimpses of the young king who had already, in his short reign, become a legend. And moving through all of this, Alexander would have been accompanied by the visible apparatus of his power. Officers in their armor, the controlled deference of everyone who recognized him, the parting of crowds that happens automatically around genuine authority, the way that space itself seems to rearrange in deference to certain kinds of presence. He was the most consequential person many of these Corinthians would ever see in their lives, and they knew it, and their bodies knew it before their minds had fully processed the thought, bowing and stepping aside and falling into the attentive silence that power generates without needing to ask for it. And then the procession arrived at the gymnasium, at the edge of the public space where the philosopher could usually be found, and the scene that awaited them was almost absurdly simple. There was no crowd gathered in anticipation, no audience arranged for the meeting, no theatrical staging of any kind. There was an old clay storage jar, large enough for a man to lie in, positioned in a patch of open ground that caught the sun at this hour of the day. And lying in that patch of sun, stretched out with the unhurried, complete relaxation of a man with nowhere else he needed to be and nothing else he needed to be doing, was Diogenes. He did not get up. This is the detail that the ancient sources preserve with particular care, because everyone who heard the story afterward understood immediately what it meant. A king, the most powerful human being currently alive on the earth, a man whose name would within a few short years be known from Greece to India, had walked across a city to stand before this man. And the man did not rise to meet him. He did not arrange himself into a posture of respect. He did not interrupt what he was doing, which was, at that moment, nothing more than lying in the sun, absorbing its warmth with the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of a creature taking what nature freely offered. He looked up. That was all. He looked up at the figure who had arrived, blocking a portion of his light, and he waited to see what this interruption wanted. Imagine the silence of that moment. Imagine the soldiers and officers who had accompanied Alexander, standing at a respectful distance, watching their king approach a half-naked old man in a discarded jar, watching for some signal of how they were supposed to feel about what they were seeing. Outrage, on their king's behalf, that this man had not leapt to his feet? Amusement at the eccentric squalor of the scene? Some of them would have felt the specific, uncomfortable tension that arises when a social script that has always worked perfectly suddenly seems uncertain whether it is going to be followed. Alexander was the variable that determined how everyone else would feel. If he was offended, they would become offended on his behalf. If he was amused, they would permit themselves amusement. And Alexander, in this moment, was neither. He was something else. He was, for what may have been one of the only times in his adult life, genuinely uncertain how to proceed, because he was standing in front of a man who was not performing any of the responses that his presence ordinarily generated, and the absence of those responses created a kind of vacuum that even a king did not immediately know how to fill. Alexander looked down at him. The sun was behind Alexander now, his own body and the bodies of his attendants forming a wall between the philosopher and the warmth he had been enjoying. This was not, presumably, intentional. It was simply the geometry of where Alexander happened to be standing, the natural consequence of a man approaching another man who is lying on the ground. But it meant that the single thing Diogenes had been doing in this moment, receiving the sun, the one good he had not given up, the one pleasure that required no possession and no payment and no permission from any human authority, was being obstructed by the shadow of the most powerful human being in the world. And Alexander spoke. He spoke, by the consistent account of the ancient sources, with what appears to have been genuine generosity, not mockery, not the condescending charity of a powerful man amusing himself with a beggar, but something closer to actual respect, the respect of a man who has heard enough about this philosopher to suspect that he is encountering someone unusual, someone whose poverty might not indicate what poverty ordinarily indicated. He said, and the words have come down through 23 centuries with remarkable consistency across multiple ancient sources, which is itself a kind of evidence for how deeply this exchange embedded itself in the memory of everyone who witnessed it or heard about it afterward. He said, "Ask of me anything you wish, and it will be granted. Consider what was actually being offered in that sentence. This was not an idle courtesy. This was not the kind of empty politeness that powerful people sometimes extend to those beneath them. The verbal gesture that both parties understand is not meant to be taken literally. Alexander, at this point in his life, commanded resources that very few human beings in history had ever commanded. He could have granted Diogenes wealth beyond calculation, gold, land, a household of servants, a position of honor in any city in the Greek world. He could have granted him protection, status, the kind of unassailable social position that would have meant Diogenes never again had to sleep in a jar or eat what strangers chose to give him. He could have granted him an audience with the most powerful men of the age, access to the corridors of actual political influence, the chance to shape policy and history rather than merely commenting on it from the margins. He could, in short, have given Diogenes everything that every other human being in Corinth was, in that same week, desperately maneuvering and flattering and performing in hopes of receiving even a fraction of. The offer was total. Anything. Ask of me anything you wish. There was a pause. It is worth dwelling on that pause, because in the cinema of the imagination, in the way this scene has been pictured and repictured across 23 centuries of retelling, the pause is where the entire weight of the moment lives. Everyone present, the soldiers, the officers, whatever citizens of Corinth had gathered at a careful distance once they realized what was happening. Everyone present understood that they were watching something significant unfold, even if they could not have articulated exactly what. A king had offered an old beggar anything in the world, and the old beggar was not answering immediately. He was not falling over himself with gratitude. He was not naming a number, a title, a piece of land. He was lying in his jar, looking up at the figure blocking his sun, and he was actually considering the question, or perhaps not considering it at all, perhaps simply allowing the silence to stretch because he felt no urgency, no anxiety, no compulsion to fill the social void that an offer like this would ordinarily demand be filled immediately and gratefully. This is itself one of the most important and least commented upon aspects of the entire encounter. Diogenes did not rush. A man who needed something from Alexander, status, security, validation, would have rushed because the opportunity was extraordinary, and extraordinary opportunities feel fragile, feel like they might evaporate if not seized quickly. But Diogenes had nothing he needed from Alexander. He had spent decades training himself out of need, methodically and deliberately stripping away every dependency until almost nothing remained that any other human being, however powerful, could give him or take from him. And so he had the genuine luxury, a luxury that no amount of money could actually purchase, that Alexander himself, for all his power, did not possess, of simply not being in a hurry, of considering a king's unlimited offer with the same unhurried attention he might give to a passing cloud. And then he answered. The words, when they came, were not elaborate. They were not a philosophical treatise. They were not even, in the most literal sense, a request, because a request implies wanting something you do not have, and what Diogenes asked for was simply the restoration of something Alexander's own presence had taken from him in the act of arriving. Yes, he said, stand a little out of my sunlight. The silence that followed this sentence must have had a different quality than the silence that preceded it. The first silence had been a silence of anticipation. What will the beggar ask for? The second silence was a silence of recalibration, of an entire group of armed and powerful men trying to process what they had just heard, trying to determine whether this was an insult, a joke, a madness, or something they did not yet have a category for. Because what Diogenes had done, with a single short sentence, delivered without anger, without performance, without even particular emphasis, was to reveal the entire structure of the encounter for what it actually was. Alexander had offered him everything in the world that Alexander possessed the power to give. And Diogenes had pointed out, gently and devastatingly, that the only thing Alexander was currently doing to him was taking something away, blocking the one genuinely free gift that nature had been providing before the king arrived. The sun did not require an empire to access. It did not require armies or treasuries or the conquest of Persia. It was already, freely, completely his, and the most powerful man in the world, in the very act of trying to give him something, had only succeeded in obstructing the one thing he already had that was actually worth having. What did Alexander feel in that moment? The sources do not give us direct access to his interior state, and any account of his emotions is necessarily a reconstruction, an inference from his recorded behavior rather than a transcript of his thoughts. But the behavior itself is recorded with remarkable consistency. Alexander did not become angry. His officers, by several accounts, found the philosopher's response either amusing or outrageous, and some of them apparently began to mock Diogenes as they turned to leave. Easy laughter at the strange old man who had wasted the offer of a lifetime on a request for shade. But Alexander silenced them, or at minimum did not join them, and said something that has become, alongside the demand for sunlight itself, one of the two halves of the story that have survived together for 23 centuries. If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes. This single sentence deserves as much attention as the more famous line that prompted it, because it reveals something essential about what actually happened in that meeting between the world's most powerful man and the world's most deliberately powerless one. Alexander did not say this performatively for the benefit of an audience he needed to impress. There was no political advantage to be gained by publicly admiring a man who had just, in front of his own officers, declined his generosity in a manner that bordered on insult. He said it, by every indication the sources provide, because he meant it, because something in the encounter had genuinely moved him, had genuinely registered as significant in a way that the thousand ceremonial submissions and flatteries he received in any given week did not register. What had he recognized? This is the question worth sitting with, because the answer reaches into the deepest structure of what both men's lives actually represented. Alexander had spent his entire existence in pursuit of something that could be called, in the broadest sense, freedom, though he would not have used that word, would have used words like glory, conquest, destiny, the fulfillment of his nature as the descendant of gods. He believed, as so many powerful people across history have believed, that freedom was a function of accumulation. That if he gathered enough territory, enough armies, enough treasuries, enough cities bowing before him, he would eventually arrive at a state of total, unconstrained capability, the ability to do anything, go anywhere, have anything. That would constitute the ultimate human freedom. This belief was driving him, at this very moment, toward Persia, toward a campaign that would eventually carry him to India, toward a restlessness that historical tradition suggests never actually found its satisfaction, that kept expanding its horizon every time the previous horizon was reached, exactly in the way Diogenes had long argued that desire always does. And here, in a clay jar in a Corinthian street, was a man who had achieved something that looked, from a certain angle, remarkably similar to what Alexander was seeking: a state of complete freedom from constraint, complete freedom from the fear of loss, complete freedom from the need to manage the opinions and the favor of others. But he had achieved it through the exact opposite method, not by accumulating until nothing could threaten him, but by divesting until nothing remained that could be threatened. Alexander was building an empire so vast that no power on earth could challenge it. Diogenes had reduced his needs so completely that no power on earth had anything left to take. They were two answers to the same question: what does a free human life require? And they pointed in entirely opposite directions, and Alexander, for one suspended moment in a Corinthian street, looking down at a man who needed nothing from him, may have glimpsed the possibility that the philosopher's answer was the truer one. He would not act on this glimpse. This is the part of the story that the popular retelling often omits, because it complicates the clean, inspirational shape of the anecdote, but it is essential to understanding what actually happened and what it actually meant. Alexander did not abandon his campaign. He did not lay down his armor, give away his treasuries, and take up residence in a jar of his own. He continued on the path he had already chosen, the path that would carry him through Persia and into Egypt and across the vast Persian Empire, and eventually into India, conquering as he went, accumulating a scope of territorial control that no individual human being had previously achieved or would achieve again for centuries. The admiration he expressed for Diogenes in that single sentence did not translate into a change of life. It remained, as such moments of clarity so often remain for people who are deeply committed to a different path, a glimpse rather than a conversion, a brief, genuine recognition of an alternative that was acknowledged and then set aside, because the gravitational pull of his own ambitions, his own sense of destiny, his own deeply ingrained identity as a conqueror, was simply too strong to be redirected by a single encounter, however striking. This, too, is part of what the meeting teaches if you sit with it long enough. Recognition of truth and transformation by truth are not the same thing. Alexander could see, with apparent clarity, that Diogenes possessed something he himself lacked. He could even articulate it, in that famous wish to trade places. And still he turned, and walked back through the streets of Corinth toward his armies and his ships and his unfinished war, because seeing a truth and being changed by it required different kinds of courage, and the courage to abandon an entire identity, an entire structure of ambition and meaning that a person has built their life around, is rarer and more difficult than the courage merely to recognize, intellectually, that the structure may be built on the wrong foundation. Diogenes, for his part, returned to the sun. This is perhaps the most quietly remarkable detail in the entire story, more remarkable in some ways than the famous exchange itself. The most powerful man in the world had just stood before him, offered him anything, and departed, an event that would have consumed the thoughts and conversations of virtually anyone else in Corinth for weeks afterward, an event that ordinary people would have replayed and embellished and built their entire sense of self-importance around for the rest of their lives. And Diogenes, as far as the sources indicate, simply returned to what he had been doing before the interruption. He resumed his place in the warm patch of light. He did not seem to regard the encounter as a particularly significant event in his own life, because in the framework of values he had spent decades constructing, it was not particularly significant. A king had come and gone. Kings did that. They arrived with their power and their offers and their armies, and they departed, and the sun continued to fall on the ground exactly where it had always fallen, indifferent to which king was currently claiming to rule the territory beneath it. Diogenes had told the truth, as he always told the truth, to whoever happened to be standing in front of him at the time, and the fact that this particular truth-telling had been directed at the most powerful man alive did not, in his accounting, make the truth more or less true, or make the telling of it more or less ordinary. The years that followed this encounter unfolded with a consistency that, in retrospect, is one of the most striking features of Diogenes' entire life. He did not become more famous in his own behavior, did not begin performing for the legend that the Alexander story would inevitably attach to him. He continued precisely as he had before, sleeping in his jar, eating what was given to him or what he could forage, walking through the agora with whatever object currently served his philosophical purposes, engaging anyone who crossed his path with the same uncompromising directness he had always employed. The story of the encounter with Alexander spread, as such stories do, faster and further than almost anything else associated with him, becoming in time the single most famous anecdote of his entire life, the image that more than any other came to define how subsequent centuries would remember him. But Diogenes himself seemed entirely unmoved by his own increasing fame. This, too, was consistent with everything he had argued. If reputation did not matter, then it did not matter whether the reputation was good or bad, whether it was obscure or famous, whether it attached him to kings or to beggars. He had told Alexander to move out of his light. He would have said the same thing, in the same tone, to anyone else who happened to be standing in the same place. He grew old in Athens, or perhaps it was in Corinth. The sources disagree slightly on the geography of his final years, which is itself a small testament to how little he had invested in being tracked, recorded, and located by the institutions that ordinarily keep careful account of where important people are and what they are doing. What they agree on, with remarkable consistency, is the manner of his death, and even this agreement is itself revealing, because the various accounts that have survived all point toward the same essential truth even where the literal details diverge. Diogenes died exactly as he had lived, without struggle, without complaint, without any apparent fear of the thing that terrifies almost every other human being who has ever lived. Some accounts say he held his breath until he died, a final act of will exercised over the one thing, his own body's most basic processes, that he had spent his life demonstrating he could master rather than be mastered by. Other accounts describe an illness, contracted perhaps from spoiled food, met with the same equanimity he had brought to every discomfort he had ever encountered. The precise mechanism matters less than the consistent shape of the story. He approached the end of his life the same way he had approached everything else in it, without performance, without terror, without the desperate bargaining and denial that so often accompanies human beings toward their final hours. He had spent decades training himself not to fear poverty, not to fear cold, not to fear hunger, not to fear the judgment of kings and crowds alike. Death, when it arrived, found a man who had already done the difficult work of meeting it without flinching. His followers, by one account, asked how he wished to be buried, and he reportedly told them that it did not matter, that they could throw his body outside the city walls for the animals, since he would have no further use for it, and no further interest in what was done with the instrument once its operator had departed. When they protested that this seemed an undignified fate, that surely he did not wish to be devoured by wild animals, he is said to have replied that they could place a stick beside him so he could fend the animals off, and when they pointed out that he would be dead and therefore unable to use the stick, he asked them, with what one imagines was something close to amusement, why then they thought he would care at all what happened to a body he was no longer occupying. This was the final philosophical demonstration, consistent with everything that preceded it. The body was not the man. The reputation was not the man. The possessions, the comforts, the social position, the elaborate apparatus by which human beings ordinarily constructed and defended a sense of self. None of this was the man. What remained, when all of it was stripped away, when the body itself had ceased to function and the question of its disposal had become a matter of complete indifference to the person who had inhabited it, what remained was simply the fact of a life that had been lived, for decades, in the most uncompromising possible alignment with a single, consistently applied understanding of what actually mattered. Reason, virtue, the natural life, free of artificial constraint. The refusal to be enslaved by anything, not wealth, not status, not the good opinion of others, not even, in the final accounting, the fear of death itself. It is worth pausing, now that the events have been told, to sit with what they actually mean, not as a sequence of historical occurrences to be catalogued and remembered, but as a sustained argument about the nature of human freedom that has lost none of its force in the more than 2,000 years since Diogenes lay in his jar and told the most powerful man in the world to step out of his light. Because the central tension of his entire life, the tension that the encounter with Alexander crystallized more perfectly than any other single moment, is a tension that has not disappeared from human experience. It has simply changed its costumes. The armies and the empires of the ancient world have given way to other forms of accumulation and power, other ways that human beings convince themselves that enough acquisition, enough status, enough control over their circumstances will eventually produce the freedom they are seeking. The basic structure of the error, if it is an error, remains remarkably constant across the centuries. We still tend to believe, in the deep and largely unexamined places where our actual behavior is determined, that freedom is something to be built through addition. More money will make us free of financial anxiety. More status will make us free of the fear of being overlooked or disrespected. More control over our environment, our relationships, our circumstances, will make us free of the vulnerability that comes from depending on a world we cannot fully predict or command. We pursue these forms of addition with the same restless, never quite satisfied energy that drove Alexander from Greece to Persia to Egypt to India, always certain that the next acquisition would be the one that finally produced the freedom we were chasing, and somehow never quite arriving at the place where the chasing stopped. Diogenes offers, across the distance of all those centuries, a different and far more uncomfortable proposition. He suggests that freedom is not built through addition but achieved through subtraction. That the things we accumulate in pursuit of security are, in his stark formulation, the very things that make us less secure, because every possession is also a point of vulnerability. Every status is also a thing that can be diminished. Every comfort we become dependent on is also a comfort whose absence we will then have to fear. The man who needs nothing cannot be threatened by the loss of anything. The man who has built his identity entirely around what cannot be taken from him, his own reasoning mind, his own capacity for virtue, his own relationship with a sun that shines freely on beggars and kings alike, has achieved a form of security that no army, no fortune, no accumulation of worldly power can actually provide, because that form of security was never dependent on the world's cooperation in the first place. Is this madness? The question is not merely rhetorical, and it does not have an easy answer. And perhaps it should not have an easy answer, because the discomfort of the question is part of what gives Diogenes' life its enduring power to unsettle us. By any conventional measure, the life he lived was a catastrophic failure. He died with nothing. He held no position of influence. He built no lasting institution, founded no school with a physical location and a continuous tradition of named successors in the way that Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum would continue for generations after their founders' deaths. He insulted nearly everyone he encountered who held any form of conventional power or status, and made himself, by any standard of ordinary social calculation, an unlikable and difficult and frequently abrasive presence in the lives of those around him. If you describe this life to someone without the benefit of 23 centuries of philosophical reputation attached to it, a man who lost his home through scandal, who became homeless by choice, who lived in a discarded storage container, who performed bodily functions in public, who owned nothing and depended entirely on the charity of strangers for his survival, you would very likely conclude that you were describing the symptoms of a profound psychological breakdown rather than the deliberate practice of philosophy. And yet the sources, across many centuries and many different authors with very different philosophical commitments and very different attitudes toward Diogenes' specific behaviors, consistently describe a man who seemed, by his own internal measure and increasingly by the grudging admission of even his critics, to be content. Not merely resigned to his circumstances, not merely making the best of a bad situation, but genuinely, durably satisfied with a life that external observers would have characterized as deprivation. He laughed easily, the sources suggest. He engaged with the world around him with curiosity and energy rather than the flattened effect of genuine despair. He did not exhibit the symptoms that we would now associate with mental illness: the withdrawal, the loss of function, the inability to engage coherently with reality. He exhibited, if anything, an unusually acute and penetrating engagement with reality, an ability to see through social performance to underlying truth that most people, weighed down by their own investments in maintaining comfortable illusions, simply could not match. Perhaps the most honest answer to the question of madness versus wisdom is that Diogenes occupied a position that our usual categories are not well equipped to evaluate, because our usual categories for sanity are themselves built on assumptions he had specifically rejected. We tend to define a sane, well-adjusted life partly by its alignment with social convention. The person who maintains relationships, holds property, participates in the economic and social structures of their community, is generally judged healthier than the person who does none of these things. But this definition smuggles in, without examining it, the assumption that social convention is itself a reliable guide to what actually constitutes a good and reasonable life. Diogenes' entire philosophical project was an extended argument against exactly that assumption. He believed that social convention, far from being a reliable guide to the good life, was in fact one of the primary obstacles to it, an elaborate, collectively maintained structure of artificial needs and artificial fears that prevented human beings from recognizing how little they actually required for genuine flourishing and how much of their suffering was self-imposed through the pursuit of things that did not actually serve their well-being. If he was right about this, and the philosophical tradition he founded would echo down through the Stoics, through certain strands of early Christian asceticism, through countless later thinkers who would draw on Cynic ideas even when they did not adopt the literal lifestyle that gave the school its name, then his life was not madness, but a kind of clarity so complete that it appeared as madness only to a world that had organized itself around comfortable illusions. The man holding the lantern in broad daylight was not confused about how light worked. He was making a point about how rare genuine honesty actually was in a city that prided itself on its wisdom and its civilization. The man living in the jar was not unable to secure better housing. He was demonstrating, with his own body as the proof, that better housing was not actually necessary for a worthwhile human life. The man who told a king to move out of his sunlight was not failing to recognize an opportunity. He was identifying, with perfect philosophical precision, the actual hierarchy of goods, placing a freely available patch of sunlight above anything that an empire could purchase, and meaning it, and living the rest of his life in a way that proved he meant it. What he leaves us with, finally, is not a lifestyle to be imitated in its literal particulars. Very few people across the intervening centuries have chosen to live in barrels, and this is probably, on balance, a reasonable choice for most human beings to make. What he leaves us with is a question that refuses to fully resolve, a question that the comfortable parts of every age would prefer to set aside, and that the honest parts of every age keep finding themselves returning to, in quiet moments, late at night, when the performances of daily life have been temporarily suspended and something more basic insists on being asked. How much of what I am pursuing do I actually need? How much of my anxiety is generated not by genuine scarcity, but by the fear of losing things I have convinced myself I cannot live without? If everything I currently possess and currently depend on were suddenly taken from me, as it was taken from a young man on the road out of Sinope, more than 23 centuries ago, who arrived in a strange city with nothing and discovered, to his own considerable surprise, that he was still capable of being alive, still capable of thought, still capable of something that might, with enough honesty, be called freedom. Would I find, somewhere beneath the wreckage, the same thing he found? The sun is still rising over the place where Corinth once stood, indifferent as it has always been to whoever currently claims to rule the ground beneath it. It rose on Alexander's armies, and it has long since stopped rising on any empire he built, because empires, however vast, eventually end, while the sun, as Diogenes seemed to understand more clearly than almost anyone else in his world, simply continues, freely given, owned by no one, available without payment or permission to whoever is willing to sit still long enough to receive it. He asked for nothing else. In the end, perhaps, there was nothing else actually worth asking for. And the question he carried through the agora in the light of his small lantern, searching year after year for a single honest man, was never really about the dishonesty of others at all. It was about a deeper, more uncomfortable possibility that the honesty he was searching for would require, of anyone who genuinely found it, the same complete and unflinching willingness to let go of everything that he himself had already let go of, and that this is why, in lantern light or in the brightest noon, so few of us are ever willing to be found.